What is going on, chess YouTube? So as you all know, Magnus Carlsen just disrespected the entire chess world. So with that in mind, I thought I'd show you a game today where Magnus Carlsen also disrespects Vladimir Kramnik, this time on move 3. This game is Magnus Carlsen versus Vladimir Kramnik from the 2011 Mikhail Tal Memorial. And here we go. In the game, Vladimir Kramnik opens 1c4, the English opening, and Magnus does go e5, the King's English. Then we have g3, knight f6, and bishop g2. So far, this is very standard stuff. Both sides are following perhaps the absolute main line of the English. White's setup is very logical. He may want to go, for example, knight c3, knight f3, short castles, and black in turn is going to have several different responses right here. The main lines for black are d5, heading for sort of a reversed open Sicilian, and the move c6, heading for a reversed Alpine opening. Now here on move 3, Magnus Carlsen, he does not go for any of the main lines, be it d5, c6, bishop c5, and so on. Instead, he plays the move h6, and h6 is a very dubious move. You only play that when you want to disrespect your opponent as hard as possible, and when you're playing Vladimir Kramnik, a move like h6 just rolls off the fingers. He has disrespected so many players lately, so h6 makes a lot of sense against good old Kramnik. All right, Kramnik, how is he going to respond? In the game, he does go knight to c3. Of course, beyond that, knight f3 is also playable, but that does run into the move e4, so knight c3 makes a lot of sense. But here, Magnus shows his idea. After knight c3 is played, he does go bishop b4, and here, normally in these early g3, bishop g2 lines, white does not go for an early knight c3, allowing bishop b4, but here it does happen because of black's waiting move h6. Now, Vladimir, is he going to be thrown off his game, or will he respond correctly? Well, it turns out he does know what he's doing in this position. He starts e4, gaining space in the center, then black goes knight c6, and then Vladimir does go knight g to e2, developing his knight on e2. I believe this is the Botvinnik variation of the English. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, I may be mistaking that, but overall, a very common setup for white. You go g3, bishop g2, e4, knight e2, if I can draw arrows correctly, knight e2, short castles, d3, and so on, maybe a3 and b4, and it is a very flexible setup for white. Now, Magnus, how is he going to respond? Well, in the game, he plays a very cheeky move right away, bishop c5. What is the point of this move? Well, with that knight on c3 being supported by the other knight, bishop takes c3 is not a real threat, and at some point, white in the future may want to go a3, then b4, driving back that bishop. So bishop c5 overall is sort of a prophylactic move, getting out of the way of a future a3, and overall getting it rerouted to a better diagonal. All right, now here, Vladimir Kramnik, he continues, d3, bolstering his center, very typical. He's got all his pawns on light squares. Maybe he wants to go bishop e3, queen d2, and so on. Now here, Magnus, d6. So far, Magnus has sort of a, Italian opening setup as black. Literally all these moves, h6, e5, d6, bishop c5, the knights, and so on. These are all very typical Italian moves from black's perspective. Now here, Vladimir, he does go h3, guarding g4. Perhaps the idea is he wants to follow up bishop b3, but he doesn't want to allow knight g4 ideas, putting pressure on that bishop. So overall, h3, a pretty typical move from white. Now here, Magnus, in this position, he's got a wide variety of ways to continue. For example, the main moves probably are castles and a5, but beyond that, you can also go, say, knight d4, bishop d7, and so on. But instead here, Magnus, he plays a move that, for the life of me, I cannot understand. This is a very typical Magnus Carlsen style move. He goes knight to h7. Now, what is the idea behind this move? I'm literally pulling my hair out trying to understand the genius of Magnus Carlsen. He is just beyond me. Is this some sort of disrespect, the way he disrespected the entire chess world this week, or is it something else? I'm really not sure. Overall, knight h7 is a very weird move. Perhaps the idea is he wants to go knight g5, then maybe knight e6, or maybe knight f8, then e6. That is a somewhat common rerouting process for that knight in certain openings, but here it looks very, very slow, and overall, it is not the strongest move for black here. All right, here, white continues, a3, gaining space on the queen side, perhaps setting up b4 ideas. Overall, a strong continuation, and black does go a6, giving his bishop on c5 a good retreat square on a7 if he needs it. Now here, Vladimir, instead of b4 immediately, he does castle, shows short castles on the board, and then Magnus, sure enough, he goes knight to g5, and this turns out to be a very dubious move. The knight is simply not very well placed on g5, and it's not really clear what Magnus is doing. There's no knight on f3 to attack. Perhaps the idea is knight e6, but the knight isn't even that well placed on e6, as the g3 pawn does guard f4 right now. All right, here, Vladimir, he continues. King to h2, guarding that h3 square. Of course, the knight on g5 was targeting h3. Knight takes or bishop takes was a very legitimate threat. Therefore, king h2 or b4 first, then king h2 was forced from white. All right, now Magnus, knight e6 is the move. And now here, Vladimir, he decides it is time to start the attack on the king side. Magnus has wasted literally 3 tempos with the knight, going knight h7, then g5, then e6. I don't recommend that in this sort of opening. That is just way, way too slow. And here Vladimir does turn up the heat with the move f4, gaining space on the king side. And of course, with that king off this diagonal here, f4 is a legal move. The king is not in check. All right, now here, Magnus, he has the opportunity to slightly punish Vladimir for his slightly inaccurate move order. Turns out back here in this position on the prior move, in this position right here before f4, white should have gone b4, forcing out bishop a7, and then play the move f4. Now, when you play f4 immediately, the drawback with this is black can go a5, gaining space on the queen side and locking down on b4. That would be the strongest continuation. Instead of that here, Magnus, he does go bishop d7, developing his bishop, but this move turns out is slightly dubious, and here Vladimir does correct his mistake. He does just go b4, gaining space and driving back that bishop. So, bishop a7 played in the game, and now here Vladimir, he does jump in with the knight. Knight d5 is the move. That knight is an absolute monster on d5. It's almost impossible for black to challenge it with a pawn. I mean, he would have to go knight e7, then c6, and that would create a lot of weaknesses in his camp. All right, now here, Magnus, how should he continue? Well, according to the engine, the strongest move here is to make use of that knight on e6, and it is to play the move knight cd4, jumping into the very weak d4 square. The point being, if white takes on d4, the other knight can recapture. That would be one of the only ways to make use of this very good knight here. Now, beyond that, there are other ideas, for example, h5, f6, and so on. But instead here, Magnus does go knight e to d4, but this move turns out to be a little bit dubious, and it is going to give Vladimir many different aggressive ways to continue. Overall, spending 4 tempos with that knight. Again, knight h7, then g5, then e6, then d4 was a little bit too slow, and now Magnus just does not have enough pieces on the king side to properly defend. All right, now here, Vladimir. In this position, the computer spots a brilliant way to proceed with the attack. This one is a little bit shocking. It says you want to take on e5 first. First, f takes e5. Then after d takes, you want to go c5, gaining space and locking out that bishop on a7. The point being, after d takes e5, then that d pawn no longer guards c5, and again, that bishop is in jail permanently. So overall, that would be the strongest way to go. F takes e5, then c5. Instead of that here, Vladimir, he does go knight e to c3, bolstering his knight on d5 with yet another piece, and very importantly, opening up this diagonal for the queen. For example, queen h5 could be a very real threat coming up next. All right, now here, Magnus. It turns out the threat of queen to h5 is so strong that black actually should play h5, the alpha 0 move, gaining control of h5 with the rook on h8, as the rook would defend the pawn. Now, beyond that, there are other options. For example, e takes f4 is playable, but instead of that here, Magnus, he does go bishop e6, and this turns out to be a very dubious move. I mean, first of all, you do waste a tempo going bishop d7, then e6. That does not make a whole lot of sense, but overall, a bishop on e6, it is just begging white to go f5, and here, Vladimir, he does just that. f5 is the move, driving back that bishop yet again, as if you trade on d5. Bishop takes, then white just recaptures with the knight. He will have the 2 bishops, and that would be absolutely terrible for Magnus. So here, f5 is the move by Vladimir, and now Magnus has to retreat. Bishop d7 played, and now here, Magnus, he literally wasted 2 tempos with the bishop going e6, then back to d7, just to force out f5 from white, and this move f5 was actually something he wanted to play anyway. So, Magnus, what is he doing in this game? Is this disrespect, or has he gone way off the deep end? I'm really not sure. All right, here, Vladimir, rook b1 is the move, setting up ideas like b5, potentially later in the game. An interesting choice. I'm not really sure I totally agree with it, but not bad at all. All right, now, here, Magnus. He plays yet another kind of weird move. Knight b8, jumping back with his knight. And now look at this. I mean, almost all of Magnus Carlsen's pieces are on the 7th or the 8th rank. He still hasn't castled. I mean, nothing about this game, from Black's perspective, makes any sense to me in my amateur mind. So anyway, here, Vladimir c5 is the move. He continues, gaining space on the queen side. Now, this move is sort of a pawn sacrifice. You don't want to play this lightly. The point being, after d takes c5, then b takes, bishop takes can win the pawn. And Vladimir here, and Stockfish for that matter, they say this move is not only playable, it is the right way to continue. Now, on move 18, instead of c5, there were some other options. For example, f6 makes a lot of sense. Try to force out some weaknesses in the black king side. Beyond that, bishop e3 is also quite a good move. But instead, c5 played in the game. This move is, very double-edged. All right, now here, black, what should he be doing? Well, it turns out you kind of have to take on c5. D takes c5 is the right choice. If you don't do that, white's going to get way too much of an initiative. For example, queen g4 could be coming, bishop e3, and so on. I mean, white's going to have just way too strong of an attack. So, d takes c5 was played in the game. And now here, it turns out the right continuation is you ignore the pawn on c5. Instead, queen to h5 is the right move here. That is the right way to continue. You plot your queen on h5, you threaten moves like f6, you get the attack going on the king side, and black will be in a world of trouble. Now, instead of that, here Vladimir did recapture with the b pawn. B takes c5, and this is part of the idea of rook b1 played earlier, setting up the pawn sacrifice c5 when the rook would be perfectly placed, lining down that b file, hitting b7. Now, here Magnus is a very big decision. Do you want to take on c5 and give up that pawn on b7 in the process? Or do you want to defend b7, say, I don't know, bishop c8 or something like that? Well, it turns out bishop takes c5 is the right choice. Here's how it works. Bishop takes, rook takes, and then you can just go bishop d6, centralizing your bishop, and the computer says black is doing relatively okay here. Instead of all this, in this position, black does go bishop c8, defending b7 with the bishop, but this turns out to be a lot slower, and here Vladimir is going to have many different very aggressive attacking ideas. The two best ones perhaps being f6, that is the strongest and the one played in the game, queen to h5, so queen to h5 on the board by Vladimir. The point being, the queen is just perfectly placed on h5. You're threatening f6. That would soften the king side, whether you do nothing and allow f takes g7, or you take on here, or go g6. No matter what, that pawn on h6 will be a whole lot weaker. All right, now here, Magnus. He's got to get his back rank pieces into the game. I mean, almost everything here is undeveloped. He starts with the move knight d7, a decent idea, perhaps intending knight f6, but again, his whole position here is just so slow. And here, Vladimir, he continues, knight to a4, jumping with his knight to the edge of the board. What's the idea behind this move? Well, we are about to find out. Here, Magnus does go c6, putting pressure on that knight on d5. And now, Vladimir, knight d to b6, and this was the idea of knight to a4. He knew c6 was coming, therefore, knight to a4 was played, setting up knight b6, with this knight on b6 being supported by the other knight. Now, if black takes once or twice, you can recapture, and that pawn or knight will be defended properly. All right, now here, Magnus, got to find some way to respond. Obviously, the rook on a8 is being attacked. What do you want to do about that? Well, it turns out moving the rook, say, rook b8, doesn't do a whole lot. Black's entire queen side, especially the rook and the bishop on a7, would be in permanent lockdown. So for that reason here, Magnus, he ignores the threat on the rook, and he just goes knight takes c5, winning the pawn on c5, and removing a key defender of that knight on b6. Now, this was the right move, but it's very, very complicated. Obviously, white has the option of trading on a8 right away, but the problem with that move, if you take the rook, black takes the knight on a4, and he does win a pawn and the knight for that rook on a8, and beyond that, the knight on a8 is at risk of being trapped. Therefore, that would actually be relatively okay for Magnus as black. So instead of that here, what should white be doing? Well, if you take on c5, that is actually even worse, as then bishop takes b6 is excellent for black. Instead here, Vladimir, demonstrating his sagacity, he finds the only good move as white. That is the move f6, ignoring the queen side altogether and just getting on with the attack. Again, f takes g7 is a threat, followed by queen takes f7. Therefore, you do have to do something about this threat. Therefore, in the game, g5 was played. But now here, Vladimir, he's going to have many different ways to capitalize on the very weak kingside pawns here. Now, the strongest line according to the engine here is simply, well, you start knight takes c8, then after queen takes, you take on c5, black takes, and then h4, getting the alpha 0 pawn into the game, threatening h6 g5, as then the pawn on h6 would be pinned to the rook on h8. That is overall the strongest continuation. Instead of that here, bishop takes g5 played by Vladimir, a very controversial move. Now, of course, the pawn on h6 is pinned to the rook. If you take the bishop, then white takes the rook and wins the game on the spot. However, here, Magnus, he is going to have different ways to start fighting back. He starts with the move knight takes a4, trading off those knights. Then we have knight takes a8, winning the rook on a8, but then b5, gaining space, bolstering the knight on a4, and Magnus, again, he is starting to fight back. All right, bishop e3 is the move, getting the bishop out of the future attack by the pawn on h6 if black ever goes, say, rook g8 and so on. And now here, Magnus the goat, another very interesting choice, bishop b8, retreating yet another piece back to the back rank, but it turns out the bishop is not that poorly placed on b8. For example, if white ever takes on d4, bishop takes d4, that was part of the idea of bishop e3. Then after e takes d4, the bishop will be lining up against the white king on h2 on this diagonal. So bishop b8, actually not a bad square for the bishop at all. All right, now here Vladimir, he continues g4, gaining space on the king side. And now here black has a couple of very good responses, the two best ones being knight to e6 and bishop e6. Instead, in the game, rook g8 played, lining up the rook with the pawn. Maybe there's going to be some sort of sacrificial idea on g4. We'll have to wait and find out how that's going to happen. And now here, Vladimir, he takes the bait. Of course, rook to g8 does give up the defense of the pawn on h6, and Vladimir does trade on h6. He takes the pawn, but it turns out that was not the right way to go. Instead, you need to trade on d4 first. Bishop takes d4, and then take the pawn. Instead, in the game, queen takes h6 played, and this move is a little bit dubious, as you can see by the eval bar kind of collapsing on the left side of your screen. This move was a very significant mistake, and Vladimir does throw away most of his advantage. All right, now here, black, bishop e6 is the move, centralizing his bishop. Magnus here, starting to fight back after his very dubious and very disrespectful opening idea. Now, Vladimir, once again, you do need to trade on d4. Bishop takes d4 is the right way forward, but instead here, rook b to c1 was played in the game, putting pressure on c6, and again, this move is also dubious, and Magnus might even be better here if he finds the right move, and he does. And the move here, you know what, if you like, pause the video right now and try to find the very Magnus-esque move right here in this position. That is your one hint. This move has Magnus written all over it. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. All right, here, Magnus, of course, he plays the ball cloud style move, king to d7, artificially castling his king on the queen side. His goal is maybe king to c8, then b7, and the king would be relatively safe on that square, not to mention hit the knight on a8, trying to win that piece. All right, here, Vladimir, he continues. Bishop takes d4, then e takes. Of course, with the king on d7, queen takes d4 is not possible as the queen is blockaded. And now here, Vladimir, e5, a very powerful move. The point being, you are giving up that pawn on e5 with check, but you open up the diagonal for the Catalan-style bishop. Now, bishop takes c6 is being threatened. That is very, very important. All right, now here, you can take on e5. Bishop takes e5 is not only playable, it might be the strongest move here, but instead, knight to c3 played in the game by Magnus, trying to, blockade the c-file, trying to stop. Bishop takes c6 dead in his tracks, but Vladimir, he is not done. He is not slowing down. He does not see ghosts. He simply takes the knight. Rook takes c6, giving up the rook for the knight. The rook sacrifice. What is Vladimir doing? Is this disrespect? No, it is not. It turns out this is the strongest move here. The point is, you have to attack with everything you've got before black can stabilize. That is the only way to try and get that knight back into the game and try to keep it alive. All right, Magnus, he does not take on c3 yet. Instead, bishop takes e5 is played first, hits the king, king to h1 is the response, and then d takes c3. All right, what is the follow-up for Vladimir? It's simple. Queen to e3, sliding back with the queen, threatening queen to a7, and then the knight on a8 will be defended. That is the entire idea, and beyond that, of course, you are hitting the bishop on e5. If black takes the knight, you win the bishop, and you do stay with even material. Wow, Vladimir playing a brilliant game so far. All right, now here, Magnus, what should he be doing? Well, it turns out the best move is just bishop d6, trying to retreat your bishop and keep it centralized. Instead, in the game, queen to b8 play by Magnus. A very strange move, defending the bishop with the queen and keeping it on here. Vladimir, he's not done. He goes queen to c5, flying in with the queen, missing the slightly stronger d4 followed by d5, but queen c5 also quite decent. Now we have queen d6, offering the queen trade. Vladimir says, no way, Jose. Queen a7 is the move, hitting the king and keeping that knight on a8 alive. I mean, knight takes a8 was played so much earlier in the game, and it's shocking that knight can still stay alive this far into the game. All right, king d8 is the move. Now we have queen takes a6, winning a pawn, bishop d4, then queen to a5. Now here, the checks begin. Queen a5 check, hits the king. King to c8, queen a6. And here, if Magnus wants to play on, it turns out he is better here despite being down a single pawn. And if he wants to play on, the strongest move is king to b8, pressuring the knight on a8. And it turns out the king is quite safe on b8. Now, instead of that here, Magnus, he does go king to d8. And here, both sides effectively agree to a draw after queen a5, king c8, queen a6. And that is all she wrote. It is the third time both sides have reached this exact position. Therefore, it is a draw by repetition. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Vladimir, where Magnus busted out the disrespect on move 3 in this crazy English opening from the 2011 Mikhail Tal Memorial. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of this game. And by the way, comment down below what you think of the ongoing drama between Magnus and the entire chess world and FIDE or FIDE, however you say it. I mean, I saw a tweet by Hans Niemann basically calling out Magnus for being, a buffoon over this. And I have to agree a little bit. I mean, if this was anyone else, they would not be getting this special treatment the way Magnus is, which, I get it. Magnus brings eyeballs. He brings a lot of money. I get why FIDE would do it. But at the same time, if they're going to punish other players for similar mistakes, it makes them look really, really bad when they do this. And it makes the whole Hans Niemann scenario with, all the things that are happening there look so much worse from the perspective of the chess world and the organizers. And, this is just not a good look for the chess world. So, in my opinion, Magnus here being a sore loser, he had a really bad day 1 and bad day 2 in the tournament. And then he did the jeans thing, perhaps as an excuse to get kicked out and to start a feud with FIDE again. And if he didn't have a bad day 1 and bad day 2, would the jeans scandal have happened at all in the first place? It's an interesting question. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you think about that. And, smash that like button and check out this video right here where if you want to see Vladimir get his revenge on Magnus, I have a game where Vladimir plays maybe the best game he has ever played against Magnus as far as I can find in the database. That game was incredible. So check it out and I'll see you in the next video.